as part of our DDF group, and they are in the same school all day, so that person has an impact not just in this community but throughout the region. Then we go to state, and there's always somebody from Brazil or Taiwan or Germany or France or somewhere. So it was kind of another way in which our season wasn't the same as normal, was missing that youth exchange program, and that student who usually gives a speech about their country, and it's just a fun learning experience for everybody. So I was hoping to hear you guys would say they're coming back next year, but apparently that's still a challenge. So we look forward to that, and let me know if I can ever help on that front at all. I would be more than willing to help you guys out. I'm going to share the picture so you don't have to look at me, and I think this will work. So thumbs up if you guys can see that picture. And I know many of you, and I know many of you know who this is. This is actually Barbara Kanunen, who came and visited me along with my mom and Wayne Kanunen. They came over there. So this is Kyrgyzstan, the Kyrgyz Republic, which is a small, the little Switzerland of the Switzerland of Central Asia, they call it. So can you see my map as well? Did it switch over to the map? So you can see it's in between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to the west of it, and Tajikistan to the south, borders, and then Kazakhstan to the north and China to the southeast. And that China region, you've probably hear in the news quite a bit, because that's kind of where the Uyghurs live, or Uyghurs, or however you want to pronounce them. And there's also that same ethnic group is kind of sporadically around Kyrgyzstan, including my first principal was actually Uyghur. So that's the ethnic minority group that's being discriminated, jailed, bred out, whatever you want to describe. So that's actually, there's a road that goes back and forth in southeastern Kyrgyzstan to that region, to China. So that's where it's placed. So it doesn't border Russia, but certainly Russia hovers over it historically, currently, and in the near future for sure, more so than China. And this, it is sparsely populated. There's only about 6 million people, and about 75% are Kyrgyz. And it's not, the culture is traditionally nomadic, and so it doesn't have the great physical, historical areas and buildings and mosques and structures that maybe Uzbekistan does, or other, basically every other country you've probably been to. So people come for the natural beauty. So that's a little about Kyrgyzstan to place you where you're at. Since we're talking about peace and conflict resolution, everything, kind of jump into it and try to bounce back and forth between my personal experiences, kind of on the ground level, living in a small village as a teacher. And I also was part of this non-governmental organization, which got grants and stuff for the community, as well as a women's co-op, which made handcrafts and stuff. Some of you probably bought them and or see them around. And so we sent a bunch to Ketchikan. So I was part of that as well. And kind of through those experiences, I think also gave me a good idea of how the government works and what's going on. You're embedded in I don't know if embedded is the right word, but you're intertwined with all aspects of society and politics and everything going on during that time period. I was there from 2002 to 2004. So I was actually there when the war with Iraq started, and the war with Afghanistan had started, was going on. So it was kind of a precarious time. We thought we were going to be evacuated a few times, especially with the Iraq war and the reaction in the communities. So that was not a good time for America's reputation abroad, certainly. And since this is a predominantly Muslim country, they identify as Muslim, although they're Muslim light, as the guidebooks describe them. Most of them still drink alcohol, etc. They identify culturally with Muslim. So an example is right when the war started, my host grandpa came drinking tea at about 6 a.m, and he asked me, you know, why are you Americans killing my Muslim brothers? And I was like, I wanted to spew tea all over, and how do you respond to that? So that was a difficult period to be there, I think, but it was important to be there during that time. And the American role was probably, that was also the height of the American kind of role in Central Asia, I think. And us Peace Corps volunteers being on the ground could see that writing on the wall, knowing the history, knowing the social, cultural aspects of their, and how they think. And, you know, when they were part of the Soviet Union, my host grandpa who asked that question is in this picture. And these are all World War II vets. These are World War II vets for the Soviet Union. And so you think of that a long time ago, but when I was there, they were still dominant. Of course, they fought shoulder to shoulder with people around the Soviet Union, and they still would play the Soviet music and national anthems and traditions, and honoring those veterans as if they were, which, you know, you can understand. The relationship with Kyrgyzstan and Russia is like a big brother, little brother thing. And there's horrible stories in World War II where the Russians go kind of, don't even have weapons, push them on the front lines, and most of the Central Asians, including Kyrgyz, the whole villages would get wiped out. But nonetheless, most of the people still loved and honored Russia and the protections and oversight and what they gave the Soviet Union, or what they gave Kyrgyzstan. And I think, you know, that history, also all these people grew up in the educational system of the Soviet Union, and that lingers on for a long time, right? The educational system. And then you think anybody who is over 30 years old was also in the Soviet military. So, and many of them actually were, not many of them, but they were stationed all over the place, including some I met were like, oh, you're from Alaska. I've been to Alaska. Well, not exactly Alaska, but I was in a submarine just off Alaska, spying on you guys, you know, or watching you. So it was pretty funny to have that perspective. And they were very friendly about it. And I don't think there was necessarily hatred towards America, but there was certainly indoctrinated with distrust, and just like we would be towards the Soviet Union probably. And certainly the ideas and perspectives. And I think that was helpful for me, in part, just to change those stereotypes and perspectives. Just, you cannot beat person-to-person interaction for that. You guys all know that. And that's part of why you guys do the youth exchange program and why it's so important, besides learning in textbooks, et cetera. So I think, you know, the military, the education, and then that also doesn't change. You know, they're very poor. By the way, they'd only been independent for about a dozen years, but they didn't advocate for independence. There was no independent thinking. There was no advocacy of individual liberties or democracy or any of these concepts before the revolution. And so before independence, so there was no continuation of that. There was no advocacy. It was kind of handed to them. And most of them didn't want it. And they certainly, because their lives were worse post-Soviet era, they wanted to go back to that era, just purely economically, you know, and it's hard to undervalue that aspect of it. I'll just kind of go through the pictures. Feel free to jump in and ask questions again if you want. So, you know, obviously they were quite poor. Still, there wasn't much economically for them. So they're looking back at the Soviet era in kind of how wonderful it was, right? And they didn't. No one thought, oh, this is great, we can vote or anything else. In fact, they could vote during the Soviet era, so they just continued that tradition. For example, in my village, I walked in, the mayor was a real big jovial guy, you know. They called the important people the bigs, and they literally usually were fatter than everybody else because they would get more food. So if you were fat, if you were big, that meant you were important because you got fed well by all the people. So this guy was like the biggest guy in the town too, and he was very happy and go lucky. And I walked into the regional, you know, the office, and he was just sitting there with a friend, and they were just filling out ballots. They were just filling out ballots, and they said, without any remorse or anything, they're like, no, this is what we do. This is how elections work. And he said the region wanted 90%, you know, 90% of the vote. So we have to fill it out till we get to 90% of the vote. So that's how his thinking was. And that hadn't continued, that just continued from the Soviet era. And none of the people really cared either, right? So as opposed to the American Revolution, where you have this kind of history of it and other things, and mini revolutions, even in Eastern Europe and around the world, that are where you kind of have that tradition and that society built in. There's no, even 12 years later, there was very little kind of democratic infrastructure to create that change. So they yearned to go back, and I think that was probably the same thing in Russia, you know, and one reason that Putin was able to jump right back in and continue with those traditions, and people looking for the strong man, looking for stability, looking for economic growth, far more than any kind of democratic ideals. But that seems to be hopefully changing there. But I don't think in Kyrgyzstan any of that had happened. Although I will say, as soon as I left, kind of like Lucy was mentioning, she was there, you know, during an important time. There was a revolution, the first overthrow of a president, you know, because you just had the same president for 14 years and he didn't leave, and would change the constitution, dissolve parliament, all that kind of stuff. So the personal anecdote with that is, I had one of my former students send me a picture of him sitting like in the chair, you know, of the president. And I couldn't delete that picture fast enough. You know, it's like, not exactly why we were there, to foment a revolution, but certainly it wasn't so much democracy. They were just tired of the same guy, and certainly very corrupt. And part of that corruption, I mean, America's role was kind of, they had fingers throughout. Oh, is there a comment, or can't quite see it? There we go. Oh, so what did I do? So yeah, where was I? The Revolution 2005 wasn't the last one, though. There was certainly, there's been, I think, two more. And part of that corruption, part of the anger and the corruption, you know, you tried to put in America spent a lot of money, and as did Europe and other international agencies. There was every international agency you can imagine that was in that country, you know, Doctors Without Borders, and there was heifer programs giving away, you know, food security stuff. You saw a lot of USAID, vitamin, you know, oils. I mean, everything you can imagine, because it was one of the Central Asian countries that accepted this help from international agencies as well, as opposed to maybe Tajikistan or Turkmenistan that kept international groups out. They were very open and quite poor. So there was a lot of, from religious groups to Turkish support, to anybody, and including Russians. So you just basically, Kyrgyzstan was kind of open for business in terms of the international assistance and military bases. So, but America gave a lot of money to the government for the military base in order to have it there, kind of against maybe a lot of people's will. And then they used that money to kind of hold on to power and lead to corruption. So there was a little anti-American sentiment there as well, just because of the ability to have the military base, and they knew that America gave a lot of money. And then those leaders necessarily didn't spend it on the people. So it was very, just like most countries abroad, it was a very complex relationship with the United States. But they did love, obviously, the culture, the movies, the music, the food, the sports, that they knew a lot about America, and they wanted to be that part of America. They wanted to be the part that was wealthy, that had good clothes and fashion, and the cultural part of it. I don't think there was much in terms of the democratic part, the ideals that America is also built on. So more of the cultural part, and I think it's like that international struggle we see right now, really just in that one country during this time period. And it actually had the US military base and a lot of American and Western influence in the country. And then it had Russian as well, and it had a Russian military base. And it was, I think it's the only country in the history of the world to have accepted and in a friendly manner have a US military base and a Russian military base, and they were right next to each other. And one time I was in the middle of class teaching, and I think seventh graders, and this jet, and we're kind of pushed against the mountains, my village was, in this MiG jet just flew right by and just started shaking the windows, and all the kids ran to the windows and started cheering for the Russians, and it was funny. And then you talk to them, you talk to parents, like, oh yeah, that's what they used to do as a kid too. All the parents did that as a kid. So it's kind of like cheering, and it was very interesting being an American teacher in this classroom where everybody's cheering for the Russian jets, and something that America would never think to do, probably fly by a bunch of villages to get their support. But so they had that, and certainly they had the language, the same language. People spoke Russian, and they had television channels out of the like 4 or 5 that most of them had. I think 3 of them were in Russia, from Russia, and all of the popular TV shows and all that stuff. So while they knew a lot of the movies and music and stuff, Russia probably had more influence. And they, as Russia went, Kyrgyzstan went, and they would watch those in the news. I would watch. I didn't understand most of it. I spoke Kyrgyz, but basically when America was in a good relationship with Russia, they would say good stuff about America. And then you would have shows where in America today, and they would just show some, heavyweight person just shoving blueberry pie in their face or something. And that would be like, that's what's going on in America, and just whatever it was to fit their stereotypes of make America look ridiculous. So I think that was always kind of it wasn't even a conflict. Clearly Russia was going to win out long term and win back the hearts and minds kind of the people. Both, and again, in their educational systems had not changed. I would pick up a textbook with US history, with teaching English, and it would be, it would still be written written about how great Lenin was and how horrible America was and how all Americans in the Soviet Union are spies and you need to watch out. But that would be the way. It was just brainwashing stuff. But they couldn't afford any more textbooks and whatnot. The textbooks they would get from like the Soros Foundation, they're so proud of them, they would have a special room and put all their Soros books and lock them up and then not let teachers use them because they didn't want to ruin the books, So then when important people would come, they would unlock the door and show them their Soros, library. And so I was always trying to like pull those resources to actually use them. Just a different way of thinking, and certainly always afraid of when kind of the important people from out of town came into town. So anyway, these pictures have nothing to do with it, of course. So this is a yurt, and this is the traditionally living in the mountains in the summer, and they still do that. There's a lot of people that still go up there with and this is my family, my extended family, go stay with, and they have mare's milk that they drink, and I drank it. It was quite good. That was a custom there. So, it's mostly a rural, kind of poor. There's one big mine there. There's tourism, people from Russia and Kazakhstan, other people come for tourism, and Europeans, but not much. So there was some vehicles, only the old Russian Ladas and vehicles, but a lot of horses and other stuff in villages. And they would go collect firewood and burn firewood and kind of live day to day. There was, in terms of the international support, there was also doctors, you know, they would have a lot of different doctors come for training and stuff. So I kind of felt like America was doing so much on so many levels, you know, and trying to help out Kyrgyzstan. And it just was, it was a difficult struggle, but the most important stuff certainly was educationally. But they also, just in terms of saving lives, they had doctors, and they had actually somebody I ran into ended up being friends with Rebecca and Scott Bolin. So that was kind of ironic, that small world. And he was there doing trainings in hospitals and stuff. So, but you know, in these villages, there was no medical services or anything like that per se. Rolling blackouts, kind of like Texas, rolling blackouts. So maybe half the day you would get heat. Most of the heat was just from coal. You'd go get, and the water was on the corners, just water pumps. You'd go hand pump it into a bucket, and that was your water. And you take banyas, they get sticks, and use a community kind of bath. So maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, people would go take a community bath, and they'd have sticks and beat you with it. So kind of a community feel, no police or anything else. So there were some students that rode horses to school and everything else, and most would just walk. So these are young kids. And that bridge actually had collapsed. It was an old Soviet bridge, and they built it back with a grant with mostly American money. Built this back to connect these communities on the other side of the bridge with local products, locally built, obviously. My host sister, you know, a lot of chores, focus on chores. Kind of a mix, you know, education. I think it was important, and they said it was important, and from leftover from the Soviet Union with a focus on education is important, but kids wouldn't go. I think I did track one year, and it was between like 40 and 50%, depending on the grade level. And as you went, attendance, 40% attendance. And as you went to 11th, 12th grade, certainly a lot of boys dropped out. And you've probably heard of bride kidnapping as well. So there's skinny me helping out. So yeah, it was weird because they had from the Soviet Union, females, you know, they had a lot of strong females and female leaders, and probably more advanced in terms of women's rights before America for women, yet, and it would remain in Kyrgyzstan. There was, I think both my principals were female, et cetera. And there was plenty of opportunity there, but there was also kind of bride kidnapping, and most of the really high positions in business and politics were males. But then they had this weird thing with bride kidnapping, which didn't seem to fit in with that. So there's plenty of, that's how most people have heard of Kyrgyzstan if you follow the news and stuff. Anyway, and that's where that scene in Borat is from, just for the record. I know somebody's watched that. So feel free to jump in with any questions. Like I said, it just yeah, feed corn. I mean, everyone had their plots. So left over from the Soviet Union, you had your little area of land, your little house. All the village was condensed closely, and you had your little land in the back that you would for vegetables and stuff. And then everyone would take their animals, or you would get somebody to take the animals out in the day. The cows and the sheep would leave for the day and go in the surrounding areas to eat grass and go up to the mountains and do whatever. And then they would come back at the end of the day. So this was kind of the organized plan, because it was a purely nomadic culture when the Russians took it over, and when they collectivized and organized, it was all planned. Actually know a lot of German influence in my village too, in the houses and other things. So German design, they moved people World War II from the Eastern Front to there. So you had a strange mix, and most of them had gone home, but not all of them. There were still Russians and Germans. Making food, plov, kind of meatballs, a lot of tea and whatnot. So And here's, yeah, just a lot of tea and bread and, you know, not much food. Usually when they would kill a sheep or something, they would kind of share it with their extended family and everybody. So maybe once every few weeks, you would get some meat from somewhere. So, and they would, you know, obviously boiling the water for tea. They never drank water. They couldn't believe Americans if they would be drinking water from filters or whatever, because that would kill you. So it was just mostly tea, always tea, for that reason. So there's a big, big party, and they would all sit around on the ground, and no chairs or tables traditionally. So even, yeah. So even language wise, a lot of Russian words, like hundreds of Russian words. So that part of the cultural aspect too, you know, stole and stool and everything they didn't have, because lights was the same Russian word. They didn't have any of those things when Russia took over. So they adopted all that. So it was kind of a blend. Their language was really a blend of Russian and Kyrgyz, just like it would be in other parts of the world with different colonial powers. There's a school I taught at. So the teachers would drink in the middle of the day too. They would have vodka. Hey, come here, we're drinking vodka. And, you know, it was, and they would all kind of cheat, same thing. They on tests and stuff, they would just let kids cheat because they needed to show the next level of the education, regional education minister, something, how smart they were. So like cheating was just normal. And they would wear, this is what they wore into school. So that's, I don't know where that's from, but mostly females. By the time you hit middle school, high school, most of the males would drop out. So anyway, we did do a boys camp. So me and another person got, and we went to kind of down to this Kokyungak, which is the walnut area. There's a walnut forest, and we had a boys camp down in that region. So we tried to get money, and we got, I don't know, 60 or 70 young teenage boys there because we thought it was important. The females were doing great academically, et cetera, but if they were getting stolen and pushed down, you know, there was a lot of money also internationally for women's issues. But we also felt like, hey, it would be nice to educate the boys and have a boys camp. And we struggled to get the money and support, but we finally did, made it happen. And then that was great. And we got also some male leaders from around, some politicians who were, you know, a little more on the liberal side, and knew the kind of democratic ideals. We also had one of the famous male journalists who was there, who was like the main journalist in the whole country, and often ridiculed the government in charge. And unfortunately, he was killed right after he came and spoke to us. So that was a little shocking, kind of a touch of the real world political struggle. So yeah, anyway, that's some of what I experienced. I'm again open any questions you guys have.
I have one, David.
Mm-hmm.
It's Lois.
Yeah, hi, Lois.
Hey, you have always led an active life, you know, lots of sports, etc. Was it difficult for you to be in an area where it appears that there was just a lot of sitting around?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't sit around, but certainly that was part of the culture. And there was Peace Corps volunteers, and just as effective, or just had just as good a time, or interacted, and as much as me, that just sat around and go house to house every day, drinking tea, drinking vodka, talking, and just go talk to everybody and do that. And I certainly could have done that. I'm not sure why I didn't. But yeah, instead I would teach all day at the school. And then we had these English clubs after school. And then since I didn't teach that grade during the day, there would be kids, you know, parents wanted their kids that were in second, third grade. So I ended up teaching second graders to 12th graders again in the evening. So I stayed pretty busy. And then with
Okay.
the women's Sherdock and other stuff. But yes, certainly the culture is a lot of drinking tea. There was young men would sit, just squat on corners everywhere. So if you're walking home in the evening, they would just squat, sometimes drinking, smoking, sometimes just hanging out. Just on every corner, there would be just these groups of 4, 5, 6 boys just squatting. So yeah, good question, Lois. And I definitely, it would have been a challenge for me to fully fit in there. But no, I drank a lot of tea and talked to a lot of people and drank a lot of vodka as well. Yeah.
David,
Well,
this
thank-
is, okay,
I was
Hi,
just gonna
David.
say. It's okay.
David, this is Krista Bruce. Hi.
Hi, Kristen.
It's a nomadic culture historically. I just finished reading Genghis Khan. But apparently they've been acidified, which is what civilized means. Can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about that conflict?
Well, I don't think it's a conflict in their eyes. I mean, I think those rural people have figured out a way to do both, you know. And while you can read in the history books and how people fought back and people went on their own, or how they were forced to do this and how many people died in the process because they didn't have enough food, you know, they certainly don't, they don't learn that, you know, forced collectivization is not, most of them, it's not really in their memory. It's not in their collective memory, certainly as a society. So they still see it as wonderful in the vision of going to the mountains, which, you know, a small percentage do, but maybe only 5–10%, but that's how they identify themselves. So yeah, I mean, you know, going to the yurt, taking the animals, and since they're poor, animals is still a big part of their life. So, and there's still the wild lands there, but yeah. Not sure I can fully answer that, but I don't think it's on the minds of most curious people.
So the percentage, most people have localized today.
Oh yeah, everybody. Yeah, I mean, except in the summer, they do take their yurts and they go to the mountains with all their animals, and with other people's animals and relatives, and they go there because there's more, obviously there's more food and stuff. Yep, in the winter they come back to the villages. Almost everybody, yeah. There's nobody
Okay.
necessarily, there's nobody nomadic 100 all year round, yeah, that I know of.
Thanks.
Hey,
Diane?
Dave.
Mhm.
Hey, thanks for being here this morning, Dave.
Yeah,
Really
you bet.
appreciate it. And I could listen all day because it's fascinating. Do you think, you know, the older generation obviously was still attached to Russia in many ways, emotionally and viscerally and so on. Do you think the new generation, so to speak, the next generation, the younger generation, do you think there's change in attitude towards things?
Yeah, I don't mean to leave that completely pessimistic. Certainly, absolutely. I mean, those young students just come in probably like in Russia and elsewhere. And I think you have a new chance all the time. And I think, you know, that Sylvia now, what are they, 20 years on? So now they're 50, 60, certainly that attitude's leaving but I haven't not been back. I do have some friends that have been back and say, you know, not much has changed physically, economically, all that stuff. But yeah, I do think that will change, certainly. So.
So I think we have time for maybe one more very quick question before we adjourn. So anybody else want to ask a quick question? Let's see. Oh, well, thank you so much, Dave. Really appreciate your speaking with us. Really great talk. Let's see, I'm going to stop the recording.